Well, a new intelligence report reviewed by U.S. officials suggests a pro-Ukrainian group might have carried out the attack on the Nord Stream pipelines last year, the New York Times reports. Now, U.S. officials said they had no evidence that President Volodymyr Zelensky or his top lieutenants were involved in the sabotage.
German Defense Minister Boris Pistorius warned against premature accusations or responsibility for the attacks. He said it may just as well have been a false flag operation staged to blame Ukraine, an option brought up in the media reports, as well as including in a report by Kelley Valhos in Responsible Statecraft. Executive Director of Responsible Statecraft, Kelley Valhos, joins us now to weigh in. Thank you so much for joining us, Kelley.
Thanks for having me.
So do you find the false flag commentary to be in any way persuasive?
I think it's very interesting. And I have to say, though I haven't seen it in mainstream reports, I'm not surprised. A lot of people are talking about the possibility of a CIA cover story. And it could split a number of ways. One of the theories that has been touted by some of my sources and people around town, former CIA agents, and in fact, talk about how Sy Hersh's theory and his reporting could be absolutely correct, and that the CIA, or we could look at other state actors, have put out a story, leaked a story, in which a pro-Ukrainian rogue group of actors was responsible. Even down to the boat that was found and the investigation and the team that was reportedly behind it, as a way to deflect from the actual truth. We know from our reporting from months ago that the Swedish investigators have said that only a state actor could be behind this complicated operation. So there's a lot of disbelief today out there, whether it be on Twitter, and even coming from people who don't necessarily believe Sy Hersh's version of events, who say it is highly unlikely that a rogue group of pro-Ukrainians could have been responsible for such a complicated operation.
Right. And I have to point out, this is now so far afield of the knee-jerk reaction that many, and I think the mainstream media and maybe the gut reaction of spokespersons for government said, oh, well, Russia did this. Russia is the cause of this war. The explanation for why Russia would blow this up never made a lot of sense to begin with. But now we have largely moved on. I don't hear a lot of that kind of chatter, coming anymore. So now it's, that New York Times piece said, well, maybe it could have been not Russia, but a pro-Russian group, or it could have been not Ukraine, but a pro-Ukrainian group. And then, of course, we have Sy Hersh's report saying it was the U.S. I feel like we're moving closer to the truth, or closer to an understanding that this was likely someone aligned with the Ukrainian or the Western vision, which is what makes most sense. No.
Right, and Jeremy Scahill at The Intercept had a great piece out, I think it was on Monday today, about just that we're moving closer to the truth. And he had even suggested that the pro-Ukrainian rogue operation theory might have been a cover for what really happened, and that the reporting by Sy Hersh is not so far from the events that are posited by this New York Times story. I find it very interesting. There were a few details in the New York Times story that kind of hint that Sy Hersh was onto something. One of those was a report, a passage within that report that said that European officials had found that there were 45, or at least 45, quote unquote, ghost ships on the water in the Baltic that day, or that week rather, of the explosion. And they're called ghost ships because they have likely turned off their transponders so they couldn't be picked up at the time. Now, one of the biggest criticisms against Sy Hersh's piece was that he said that a minesweeper was involved in the operation that was conducted by expert U.S. Navy divers. And those who had been calling open source intelligence, it says, well, there were no such minesweepers recorded on the Baltic that day. Well, here we have the New York Times admitting, based on European officials that there were ghost ships, that there were plenty of ships, at least 45, on the water that day that had turned off their transponders. I find that there are little elements of the story. The New York Times story and the German press had reported that this supposed rogue boat, which is a yacht that had been licensed or permitted in Poland, had been operating off the coast of Rostock, but then had completed its operation off a Danish island. Well, it was not so far from the island of Bornholm, which is the island that Cy Hirsch said that the operation had been conducted by the Navy divers. I feel like there are similar elements. Even Jack Murphy, and I hope we have time to talk about this, Jack Murphy, who is a former special operations soldier, he is a journalist. He had done 8 months of reporting on a very important story about CIA-backed saboteurs who are operating in Russia against Russian assets. He finally, after not being able to publish this in mainstream newspapers, published this on his own Substack on December 24th. So he has reporting with great sources saying that the CIA has backed saboteurs in Russia. Even he is out there. Now, he's out there saying he doesn't know if he wants to believe Cy Hirsch or even this New York Times story, but he's incredulous that we would think that a rogue group of operators could pull something like this off. And even he said in his Twitter just recently, he said the narrative about rogue Ukrainians is a controlled leak from the 7th floor, meaning the CIA. And so there are plenty of people on both sides of this story who are really questioning now what the New York Times piece is all about, and whether or not the United States is deflecting from another state actor, whether it be themselves or someone else in this regard.
Right. With reports like this, you never know whether it's like they wanted the journalist to report it or they didn't want them to. And, you could spend a lot of time sort of trying to, navigate the tone to figure that out. I obviously is completely, consistent with the history of the United States that this would have been us. The one argument I've always found extremely compelling for why I don't think President Biden would have greenlit this was the question of the price of gas, which was such a huge domestic issue, especially in the lead up to the midterms. I cannot imagine him greenlighting something that would have made gas more expensive for Americans from a domestic politics point of view. Now, I said this to a friend of mine who's, quite high up in intelligence, and he said, the CIA doesn't need, the president's green light to get involved in something like this.
Which is a huge problem, to be clear.
Exactly. Yes. So I'm wondering what you make of that. If you think it's possible that this was sort of CIA rogue, that this was something that the president himself would not, if you agree with me, first of all, that it seems unlikely that the president would have okayed something that would have been likely to make gas prices much more expensive. And also, if you think that has any bearing on the intelligence and what it means.
Well, I mean, most of the gas that had been delivered through this pipeline would go to Western sources, not the United States. And at the time, and most people, or people who have been more inclined to believe the Cy Hirsch story, have noted that there was a new pipeline, Western pipeline opening up, had just been announced like a day or a week before the Nord Stream pipeline explosions. And so Ukraine was actually, who had been fighting this Nord Stream 2 pipeline. They had lobbyists swarming all over Washington ahead of the invasion of the war. And one of my colleagues, Ben Freeman, had reported this. He did a side-to-side comparison of the number of lobbyists that had been employed by Russia and Ukraine ahead of the invasion, and found that the Ukrainian point of contact, like the firms that they had hired in Washington to do their bidding on Capitol Hill, they had 13,000 points of contact in 2021 alone, and most of those were to shut down the Nord Stream 2 pipeline because they wanted their so they benefited from this. And you see that both Ted Cruz and Bob Menendez, a bipartisan issue here thoroughly, had been really pushing for this Nord Stream 2 to be shut down. It was. I mean, the pipeline itself wasn't going anywhere once the invasion started. But the first one, Nord Stream 1, had been delivering plenty of gas to Western Europe. It was only shut down for maintenance reasons after the invasion, and then Russia said, we're not turning it back on because of the sanctions, we don't have the parts, and we can't turn it on. So it was likely that only Nord Stream 2 would have went back online anyway. But absolutely, I think both the United States and Western energy interests actually benefited from this pipeline shutting down.
Kelley, thank you so much for coming on Rising today to talk about this. We really appreciate it.
I appreciate you having me. Thank you.
And we'll have more Rising for you right after this.